June 1942, somewhere in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber at 14,000 feet, scanning the empty blue expanse below for any sign of the Japanese carrier fleet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His fuel gauge showed 20 minutes of flight time remaining before he would have to turn back toward the USS Enterprise, assuming he could even find it. Behind him, 32 other Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown followed in loose formation, their pilots equally anxious, equally low on fuel. They were hunting the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and they were hunting with an aircraft that Japanese naval intelligence had dismissed as obsolete before the war even began. Within 30 minutes, those obsolete aircraft would change the course of the Pacific War in 6 minutes of violence so complete that Japanese naval aviators would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand what had happened. But the story of that moment begins not with American triumph, but with Japanese confidence bordering on contempt. In the spring of 1941, Japanese Naval Intelligence Section 4 received their first detailed reports on American naval aviation equipment. Among the aircraft analyzed was the Douglas SBD Dauntless, the dive bomber that would equip the bulk of American carrier air groups. The assessment was thorough and dismissive in equal measure. The Dauntless was slow. Its maximum speed of 255 miles per hour made it vulnerable to fighter interception. It was heavy. At over 10,000 pounds fully loaded, it lacked the agility of Japanese carrier. Its defensive armament consisted of just 2 forward-firing machine guns and twin machine guns operated by the rear-seat radioman gunner. Japanese analysts noted that their own Nakajima B5N Kate torpedo bomber carried more ordnance and flew faster. Their Aichi D3A Val dive bomber was lighter and more maneuverable. The report concluded that while the SBD might prove adequate for training purposes, it represented outdated American design philosophy that prioritized ruggedness over performance. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who would lead the air attack on Pearl Harbor, reviewed these intelligence assessments in the summer of 1941. He found them reassuring. American carrier aviation appeared to lag behind Japanese capabilities by several years. Japanese naval aviators trained longer, flew better aircraft, and had combat experience from China that American pilots lacked. The coming war would demonstrate Japanese air superiority quickly and decisively. Fuchida shared these conclusions with his air crews during training exercises that fall. When discussing potential American opposition, he emphasized that Japanese fighters would easily handle slow, heavy dive bombers like the SBD. The real threat would come from American fighter aircraft, not from obsolete attack planes. The Douglas Aircraft Company had begun developing what would become the SBD in 1938, responding to a Navy Bureau of Aeronautics requirement for a new scout bomber. The designation SBD stood for Scout Bomber Douglas, reflecting the aircraft's dual role. Ed Heinemann led the design team at Douglas's El Segundo plant in California. Heinemann believed in simplicity and structural strength over complexity and marginal performance gains. The SBD that emerged from his team featured a low-wing monoplane configuration with perforated dive brakes that could be deployed to control descent speed during bombing runs. The Wright Cyclone radial engine produced 1,000 horsepower, adequate but not exceptional by 1940 standards. What made the SBD unusual was its bomb load capacity and structural strength. The aircraft could carry a single 1,000 pound bomb on a centerline mount that swung forward on release to clear the propeller arc during vertical dives. Additionally, it could carry 2 250 pound bombs on wing racks. This meant a fully loaded Dauntless could deliver 1,500 pounds of ordnance, more than most contemporary dive bombers. The airframe was designed to withstand the tremendous stresses of pulling out from near-vertical dives at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. Heinemann's team built redundancy into critical structures. The wing spars were stronger than necessary. The fuselage framework was overbuilt by conventional standards. This added weight, which hurt performance, but it meant the aircraft could absorb battle damage and survive stresses that would destroy lighter aircraft. The Navy accepted the first production SBD-1 in June 1940. By December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, approximately 240 SBD Dauntless dive bombers were in service with the Navy and Marine Corps. The aircraft equipped scouting and bombing squadrons on all American maneuverable At Enterprise, Lieutenant Richard Best commanded Bombing Squadron 6, flying SBD-3 Dauntless Air. Best had logged hundreds of hours in the type and understood both its capabilities and limitations. The SBD was not a forgiving air. It required constant attention during flight. The single-engine configuration meant engine failure over water was catastrophic. The open rear cockpit exposed the radioman gunner to weather and enemy fire. The landing gear, though sturdy, made carrier landings challenging in rough seas, but Best recognized qualities that less experienced pilots might overlook. The SBD was stable in flight, making it an excellent gun platform. The dive brakes allowed precise control during attack runs. The visibility from the cockpit was exceptional, critical for spotting targets and threats. Most importantly, the aircraft could absorb punishment. Best had seen SBDs return from training exercises with significant damage, holes in wings and fuselage that would have downed lighter air. The structural overbuilding that made the SBD heavy also made it survivable. Japanese pilots flying the Aichi D3A Val dive bomber enjoyed performance advantages. The Val was faster at 265 miles per hour. It was more maneuverable, with a lighter wing loading that made it nimble in combat. It climbed faster and could operate from shorter flight decks. Japanese naval aviators had used the Val extensively in China, refining their tactics against minimal opposition. By late 1941, Japanese dive bomber pilots were among the most experienced in the world. They had perfected the art of the steep dive attack, approaching targets at angles exceeding 70 degrees from vertical, releasing their bombs at altitudes below 2,000 feet to ensure accuracy. Their training was exhaustive. A Japanese naval aviator might spend 3 years in training before joining a carrier air group. American pilots, by contrast, typically received less than a year of training before assignment to combat units. The combination of superior training, combat experience and adequate equipment gave Japanese naval aviators confidence that bordered on airlays. They expected to dominate any engagement with America. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 seemed to confirm Japanese superiority. Of the 183 aircraft in the first wave, 51 were Aichi D3A Val dive bombers. They attacked with devastating precision. Vals from carriers Akagi and Kaga concentrated on Battleship Row, achieving multiple hits. The second wave included 78 additional Vals that attacked the naval yard and airfield installations. American losses were catastrophic. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers were hit. 188 aircraft were destroyed, most on the ground. Japanese losses totaled 29 aircraft, including just 3 Vals. The lopsided victory seemed to validate everything Japanese planners believed about their tactical and technical superiority.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Among the few American aircraft that managed to engage the attackers were several SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, which was returning to Pearl Harbor during the attack. These SBDs, flying in singly or in pairs, were attacked by Japanese fighters. Several were shot down. The survivors managed to land at various airfields around Oahu, some with significant damage. Japanese pilots who engaged the SBDs reported them as easy targets, slow, heavy, and apparently flown by inexperienced pilots. The American dive bombers posed little threat. After-action reports recommended that Japanese fighters ignore American dive bombers unless no other targets were available, as they were insufficiently dangerous to warrant attention. This assessment spread through the Japanese naval aviation community in the weeks following Pearl Harbor. When discussing potential threats in future operations, Japanese briefings emphasized American submarines and the need to locate American carriers before they could launch strikes. American carrier aircraft, particularly slow dive bombers, were considered secondary threats that could be handled by combat air patrols with minimal effort. The first challenge to this assumption came in February 1942 during American hit-and-run raids on Japanese-held islands in the Marshall and Gilbert groups. Enterprise and Yorktown launched strikes against Japanese installations, with SBD Dauntless dive bombers forming the bulk of attack forces. On February 1, 1942, SBDs from Enterprise attacked Kwajalein Atoll. The bombers approached at medium altitude, then pushed over into steep dives against ships in the anchorage. Japanese sailors manning anti-aircraft guns tracked the attackers with increasing alarm. The American dive bombers came straight down at angles approaching 70 degrees, diving through intense defensive fire without wavering. Bombs began hitting with precision that surprised Japanese observers. The transport Bordeaux Maru took a direct hit that penetrated deep into the hull before exploding, breaking the ship's back. The submarine tender Yamato Maru absorbed multiple hits that left it burning and listing. The light cruiser Katori was narrowly missed by 3 bombs that bracketed the ship, sending up massive water columns that drenched the deck. What impressed Japanese observers most was the Americans' persistence. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with exploding shells, the SBDs continued their dives until releasing their bombs at altitudes below 2,500 feet. Only then did they pull up, often passing through their own bomb blasts as they recovered from the attack dive. Several SBDs were hit during these attacks. Japanese gunners saw smoking American aircraft with visible damage to wings and fuselages, but the dive bombers kept flying. Aircraft that should have crashed instead maintained formation and headed back toward their carrier. The structural strength that made the SBD heavy also made it remarkably difficult to shoot down. Reports from Kwajalein filtered back to Japanese headquarters. The assessment remained largely unchanged. American dive bombers had achieved some successes, but against lightly defended targets. The attacks had benefited from surprise and the absence of significant fighter opposition. Given proper warning and adequate fighter cover, Japanese defenses would have destroyed the attacking force. The key was maintaining strong combat air patrols and ensuring that radar or scout planes provided early warning of approaching strikes. Through March and April 1942, American carriers continued launching raids against Japanese positions across the Pacific. SBDs participated in strikes on Wake Island, Marcus Island, and each operation refined American tactics and built experience among dive bomber crews. Lieutenant Richard Best and his squadron mates in Bombing 6 developed techniques for coordinating attacks. Rather than attacking individually, after the 4-section attacks where multiple air would dive on a single target in rapid succession, the first bomber would draw defensive fire. Subsequent aircraft would attack while anti-aircraft gunners were tracking the initial attacker or reloading. This tactics required precise timing and formation discipline, but when executed properly, it multiplied the effectiveness of each attack and reduced losses. The SBD's stability during dives made these coordinated attacks possible. Unlike more maneuverable aircraft that might drift off target during steep dives, the Dauntless tracked straight and true. Pilots could focus on their target without fighting their air. The perforated dive brakes allowed precise speed control. A pilot could deploy the partially for a controlled descent or fully to slow to optimal bombing speed. The bomb sight in the SBD was simple but effective. A telescopic sight mounted on the left side of the windscreen provided magnified view of the target. During a dive, the pilot would align the target in the sight, make final corrections for wind and aircraft motion, then release the bomb when the aim point crossed the target. With practice, experienced pilots could consistently place bombs within 50 feet of their aim point from altitudes above 10,000. Throbbing into dives that terminated at release altitudes below 2,500 feet. Japanese intelligence continued monitoring American carrier operations through spring 1942. Analysis of American tactics noted the emphasis on dive bombing. Reports observed that American air groups appeared to favor dive bombers over torpedo bombers for ship attacks. This seemed puzzling to Japanese planners. Torpedo attack, while more difficult to execute, delivered more destructive power against ships. The Type 91 aerial torpedo used by Japanese Kate bombers could sink any ship with a single hit below the waterline. American even the 1,000 pound carried by the sink large hits to sink large warships. The preference for dive bombing suggested American torpedo attack capabilities were inadequate or that American pilots lacked the skill for low-level torpedo runs. This assessment missed a crucial reality. The SBD's 1,000 pound bomb was not designed primarily to sink ships through explosive force alone. The Mark 13 bomb carried by the Dauntless featured a case-hardened nose cone designed to penetrate armored decks before detonating. When dropped from high altitude and accelerated through a steep dive, these bombs achieved impact velocities exceeding 600 feet per second. Those speeds, the hardened penetrator could punch through several inches of armor plate. Ship designers had traditionally focused armor protection on belt armor, protecting the sides of warships below the waterline. Deck armor was typically thinner, designed to protect against plunging fire from distant battleships, not from bombs arriving at near vertical angles with The high-kinetic aircraft carts, particularly vulnerable to deck penetration. Carrier flight decks were built for aircraft operations, not they needed to be relatively light to avoid making the ship top-heavy. They needed to be smooth to allow aircraft to land and take off safely. These requirements meant flight decks had minimal armor. Japanese fleet typically had flight decks constructed of wood planking over steel framework. The wooden deck surface was only inches thick. The steel support structure beneath ranged from 1 to 3 inches depending on location. This construction was adequate for normal operations and could handle bombs that detonated on the surface, but it could not resist penetration by hardened bombs traveling at high velocity. Below the flight deck lay the most vulnerable spaces on any carrier. The hangar housed aircraft being as real lines ran throughout the hangar to supply ammunition. Magazines for aircraft ordnance were located near the hangar for easy access. Workshops for aircraft maintenance contained flammable materials and pressurized gas cylinders. A bomb that penetrated the flight detonated in the hangar deck could trigger catastrophic secondary explosions and fire. Yet this vulnerability remained theoretical through the first months of the Pacific War. Japanese carriers had operated with near impunity. American attacks had been too small and too scattered to threaten the Japanese carrier fleet seriously. That changed on May 7, 1942, in the Coral Sea. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first naval engagement where opposing fleets never sighted each other directly. All attacks were conducted by carrier aircraft. On the morning of May 7, American scout planes located Japanese cannon support in the invasion of Port Moresby. Lexington and Yorktown launched strikes totaling 93 aircraft, including 53 SBD Dauntless dive bombers. The target was the light carrier Show escorting invasion transports. The SBDs approached from different directions, overwhelming Show's defenses and combat air patrol. Within minutes, 13 bombs struck the carrier. Several penetrated the thin flight deck and detonated inside the ship. Fires erupted throughout Show. Aviation fuel ignited, turning the hangar deck into an inferno. The carrier's damage control parties fought desperately to contain the flames, but the intensity overwhelmed their efforts. Within 20 minutes of the first bomb hit, Show was dead in the water, burning uncontrollably. She sank shortly afterward, the first Japanese carrier lost in the war. Japanese naval staff in Tokyo received news of Show's loss with shock. A carrier sunk by air attack was unprecedented in Japanese experience. Initial reports suggested torpedo hits had sunk the vessel. When more detailed accounts arrived confirming that dive bombing had been the primary attack method, skepticism remained. Show was a light carrier, smaller and more vulnerable than fleet carriers. Her loss did not necessarily indicate a threat to larger, better protected vessels. The following day, May 8, provided a more troubling data point. American and Japanese carrier forces located each other almost simultaneously and launched strikes. SBDs from Lexington and Yorktown attacked the fleet carrier Shokaku. The Japanese carrier's combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire destroyed several attackers, but multiple dive bombers broke through the defenses. 3 1,000-pound bombs struck Shokaku. The first hit near the bow, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in a forward maintenance space. The blast tore a massive hole in the deck and started fires that spread through fuel lines. The second bomb struck amidships, again penetrating before detonating. This explosion reached the hangar deck, where aircraft were being prepared for the second strike wave. Planes filled with fuel and armed with bombs and torpedoes began exploding. The third hit was aft, adding another fire to the growing conflagration. Shokaku's crew fought the fires with determination born of desperation. They managed to contain the blazes after several hours of brutal effort. The carrier survived, but was so heavily damaged that she required months of repairs. She played no further part in operations for the remainder of 1942. For the first time, Japanese naval aviation confronted the reality that American dive bombers posed a genuine threat to fleet carriers. 3 bomb hits had nearly sunk one of Japan's newest carriers. If the damage control efforts had failed, if one more bomb had struck a critical space, Shokaku would have gone down. Japanese after-action reports from Coral Sea made specific observations about American dive bombing techniques. The SBD Dauntless approached at high altitude, making interception by combat difficult. The aircraft could absorb significant damage from anti-aircraft fire yet continue their attacks. Most concerning was the steep angle of attack, approaching vertical, that made the dive bombers difficult targets for gunners and allowed their bombs to build devastating impact velocity. Recommendations from Coral Sea included strengthening combat air patrols, improving radar early warning systems, and increasing anti-internet densities. Conspicuously absent from recommendations was any suggestion to strengthen flight deck armor. The possibility that American bombs could consistently penetrate flight decks and reach vulnerable internal spaces was acknowledged but not addressed. Material constraints provided part of the explanation. Adding armor to flight decks would require extensive redesigns and months of shipyard work. Japan's carrier fleet was fully committed to operations. Ships could not be spared for major modifications, but there was also a cultural factor at work. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized offense over defense. Carriers were strike platforms, not defensive positions. The proper response to threat was to strike first and strike harder, not to thicken armor and hide behind protection. This offensive mindset had served Japan well in the early months of war. It would prove catastrophically misguided at Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, planned the Midway operation as the decisive blow that would destroy American carrier forces and force the United States to negotiate peace. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, would form the strike force. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Their aircrews were the elite of Japanese naval aviation, veterans of campaigns across the Pacific and years of combat in China. Intelligence suggested that no more than 2 Americans could respond to the Midway attack. Japanese planners expected to face Enterprise and Hornet. They did not know that Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, had been frantically repaired at Pearl Harbor, and would join the battle. Even if all 3 American carriers participated, Japanese confidence remained high. 4 carriers against 3, with superior aircraft and more experienced carriers, gave Japan overwhelming advantage. The battle would be decided in the first exchange of strikes. Whichever fleet launched first and hit hardest would win. Japanese planning focused obsessively on locating American carriers and striking before they could launch. Defensive considerations received less attention. The 4 carriers would operate together in a tight formation, allowing them to coordinate combat airs and concentrate anti-air. This formation had worked perfectly at Pearl Harbor, and in subsequent operations throughout the Pacific. There was no reason to expect Midway would be different. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, understood the stakes. His 37 Dauntless dive bombers would hunt the most dangerous naval formation in the world. If they found the Japanese carriers, they would face experienced fighter pilots, massed anti-air, probably insufficient time to coordinate their attack properly. If they failed to find the carriers, or if their bombs missed, American forces at Midway would be destroyed, and the Japanese fleet would be free to threaten the Hawaiian. McCluskey had confidence in his pilots and their aircraft. The SBD had proven it could take punishment and deliver accurate attacks, but he also recognized that luck would play a role. Luck in finding the enemy fleet in thousands of square miles of empty ocean. Luck in catching Japanese carriers at a vulnerable moment. Luck in having bombs that would penetrate and explode where they could cause maximum damage. The morning of June 4, 1942 began badly for American forces. Japanese aircraft attacked Midway Island at dawn, causing significant damage to facilities and destroying several aircraft on the ground. American bombers from Midway attempted to attack the Japanese carriers but were shot down in large numbers with no hits achieved. Torpedo bombers from all 3 American carriers pressed home desperate attacks through massed fighter opposition. 41 Devastator torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese carriers that morning. 35 were shot down. 0 achieved successful torpedo hits. The attacks seemed suicidal and futile, but they had one crucial effect that would determine the battle's outcome. Japanese fighters defending their carriers had descended to low altitude to engage the American torpedo bombers. While they were slaughtering Devastators at wave-top height, they left the high-altitude zones undefended. Wade McCluskey's dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet at precisely the moment when combat air patrol was at low altitude and Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. The carriers were recovering aircraft from the Midway strike and preparing to launch attacks against the American carriers that Japanese scouts had finally located. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed. McCluskey looked down from 14,000 feet and saw 3 carriers in a triangular formation, their decks packed with aircraft. He made his decision in seconds. He would attack the 2 nearest carriers, Kaga and Akagi. He ordered his squadrons to divide. Bombing Squadron 6 would take the nearer carrier. Scouting Squadron 6 would attack the farther vessel, then he pushed his Dauntless into a steep dive. Behind him 32 more SBDs nosed over and followed their commander down. The Japanese carriers had perhaps 90 seconds of warning. Lookouts spotted the American dive bombers already in their attack dives. Alarm bells clanged throughout the ships, gun crews scrambled to their weapons. Fighter pilots on deck looked up helplessly at the attackers descending through the sky. Richard Best followed McCluskey down, his SBD accelerating through 200, 250, 280 miles per hour as the dive steepened. Akagi grew larger in his windscreen, her flight deck clearly visible with rows of aircraft spotted for launch. Best could see crews running across the deck, tiny figures scrambling for cover. He could see the red circles on aircraft wings, the rising sun symbols painted on the carrier's deck. Anti-aircraft fire began reaching up toward the diving Americans. Black puffs of exploding shells appeared around Best's aircraft. He ignored them, concentrating on keeping Akagi centered in his bomb sight. At 2,500 feet, Best released his 1,000-pound bomb and hauled back on the stick, pulling out of the dive with force that crushed him into his seat. The bomb fell free, accelerating even faster than the aircraft had been diving. It struck Akagi's flight deck amidships and punched through the wooden planking as if it were paper. The penetration took perhaps a tenth of a second. Then the bomb detonated in the upper hangar deck. The explosion ripped through aircraft packed tightly together. Aviation fuel ignited instantly. Bombs and torpedoes hanging from aircraft exploded in sympathetic detonations that magnified the destruction. The blast wave tore through the hangar, shredding aircraft and men with equal ease. A second bomb struck seconds later, forward of the first. This one detonated in a lower hangar space, starting additional fires and causing more secondary explosions. A third bomb hit aft, wrecking the carrier's steering gear and jamming the rudder. Within 2 minutes of the first bomb hit, Akagi was burning out of control. The carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was dying. A quarter-mile away, Kaga was suffering identical destruction. 5 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession. Each penetrated the flight deck before exploding. Each triggered massive secondary explosions and fires. The hangar decks became infernos as aviation fuel and ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. Kaga's crew fought desperately to contain the damage, but the fires spread faster than damage control parties could contain them. Even as Akagi and Kaga burned, the third carrier in McCluskey's sight, Soryu, came under attack from Yorktown's dive bombers approaching from a different direction. 3 more 1,000-pound bombs struck Soryu in quick succession. 3 more flight deck penetrations, 3 more hangar deck explosions. Within 10 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were burning wrecks, their decks torn open, their hangar spaces consumed by uncontrollable fires, their crews abandoning ship or dying in the flames. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, escaped the initial onslaught and launched a counterattack that heavily damaged Yorktown, but that afternoon, American dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu and repeated the devastation. 4 more bombs struck the carrier, all penetrating the flight deck, all triggering massive explosions and fires in the hangar spaces below. By evening of June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or had already sunk. Akagi burned through the night, before being scuttled by Japanese destroyers. Kaga sank first, going down in the evening with massive internal explosions tearing the hull apart. Soryu sank in the early evening, her back broken by the fires and internal explosions. Hiryu lasted longest, finally sinking early on June 5 after her crew abandoned ship. The Battle of Midway was over. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and more critically, the experienced air crews that had formed the spearhead of Japanese naval aviation. American losses were heavy, 1 carrier sunk and another damaged, but the exchange was devastatingly one-sided. The SBD Dauntless had sunk 4 carriers in 1 day. The aircraft that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as obsolete in 1941 had just changed the course of the Pacific War. In Tokyo, Japanese naval staff struggled to comprehend the disaster. How had 4 carriers, protected by fighters and anti-aircraft guns, been destroyed so quickly? The answer lay in details that made the defeat even more humiliating. The American bombs had been so effective not because of their explosive power alone, but because of where they detonated. Every bomb that struck the Japanese carriers had penetrated the flight deck before exploding. The wooden flight decks that allowed carrier operations had provided no protection against hardened bombs delivered at high velocity from steep diving attacks. The bombs had reached the most vulnerable spaces on the carriers, the hangar decks where aircraft, fuel and ammunition were concentrated. The resulting explosions and fires had been catastrophic because Japanese carriers, designed for offensive operations, had inadequate compartmentalization and any single bomb penetrating to the hangar could trigger cascading destruction throughout the ship. Survivors from the 4 carriers provided consistent accounts. The American dive bombers had attacked with precision and determination. They had maintained their dives through intense anti-aircraft fire. Many had been hit leaving trails of smoke, but continued their attacks anyway. The bombs had struck with devastating accuracy, hitting vital areas of the flight decks. Most critically, the structural damage from the penetrating bombs had prevented carriers from launching or recovering aircraft, rendering them defensively helpless even before the fires became uncontrollable. Japanese naval architects began analyzing carrier vulnerability to dive bombing. Their conclusions were uncomfortable. Flight deck armor sufficient to resist 1,000 pound bombs dropped from high altitude would require several inches of steel plating. This would add thousands of tons to a carrier's displacement, requiring larger hulls, more powerful engines, and stronger internal structures to support the weight. Alternatively, improved damage control systems and better hangar deck compartmentalization might prevent single bomb hits from causing catastrophic damage. But this too would require extensive redesigns and would reduce hangar space available for aircraft. The fundamental problem was that carriers had been designed as strike platforms, not as targets. Their offensive power had been maximized at the expense of defensive resilience. This design philosophy had worked perfectly until it faced an opponent capable of delivering precision dive bombing attacks against the flight deck. Japanese pilots who survived Midway provided technical assessments of the SBD Dauntless. The aircraft was indeed slow and heavy as intelligence had reported. But in a dive, the Dauntless became stable and precise. The perforated dive brakes gave American pilots fine control over their descent rate. The sturdy construction meant the aircraft could sustain battle damage without crashing. The bomb load, especially the 1,000 pound centerline weapon, was devastating when delivered with precision against vulnerable targets. Several Japanese pilots mentioned the difficulty of engaging SBDs once they began their attack dives. The steep angle made pursuing them dangerous for fighters, which had to pull out earlier or risk crashing into the ocean. The dive brakes slowed the SBD enough that Zero fighters diving after them would overshoot if not extremely careful with throttle control. By the time a fighter pilot reacquired the target and lined up a shot, the SBD had released its bomb and was pulling out of the dive at low altitude where pursuing was dangerous. The combination of factors made the Dauntless remarkably effective in its role despite performance limitations that should have made it vulnerable. In the months following Midway, Japan rushed to rebuild carrier aviation capability. New carriers were commissioned. Surviving carriers received modifications to improve damage resistance. Flight decks were reinforced where possible. Firefighting systems were upgraded. Hangar deck compartmentalization was improved, but these changes could not restore the experienced air crews lost at Midway. Training pipelines were accelerated, but quality suffered as instructors with combat experience were pulled into operational units to fill immediate needs. The replacements lacked the skill and experience of the pilots lost. American dive bomber crews, meanwhile, gained confidence and refined their tactics. The success at Midway had validated their SBD squadrons throughout the Pacific studied the battle, analyzing what had worked and what could be improved. Tactics for coordinating attacks between squadrons, for dividing targets, for suppressing anti-aircraft fire through precise bombing of gun positions, all were developed and practiced. The SBD-5 variant that entered service in early 1943 incorporated lessons from 2 years of combat. The engine was upgraded to 1,200 horsepower, improving performance slightly. Additional armor protected the pilot and radioman from ground fire. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced vulnerability to fire. Ammunition capacity for the defensive guns increased, allowing the rear gunner to engage fighters more effectively. These improvements made an already effective aircraft even more capable, but they also added weight, making the SBD even slower and less maneuverable. The air's maximum speed increased only marginally to 255 miles per hour. Against modern Japanese fighters like the A6M0, the SBD remained at a serious disadvantage in inter-air combat. Yet none of this mattered once the aircraft entered its attack dive. Speed and maneuverability meant nothing when the SBD nosed over at 14,000 feet and plummeted toward its target in a controlled fall that terminated with bomb release at 2,500 feet. In those crucial seconds of the attack dive, the SBD was the deadliest anti-ship weapon in the Pacific. The Guadalcanal campaign, beginning in August 1942, provided SBD crews with sustained combat experience. Marine SBDs operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal attacked Japanese shipping attempting to resupply ground forces on the island. Navy SBDs from Enterprise and other carriers engaged Japanese naval forces in a series of battles around the Solomon Islands. The results consistently favored American. Battle of the Eastern Solomons, on August 24, SBDs damaged the carrier Ryujo so severely that she sank. In the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26, SBDs damaged carrier Shikaku and Zuiho, again demonstrating their ability to penetrate flight decks and cause massive internal damage. The pattern established at Midway repeated itself throughout 1942 and 1943. Japanese carriers faced repeated attacks by SBD dive bomber. Each attack followed the same template. American aircraft approached at high altitude. They pushed over into near-vertical dives. They released hardened penetrating bombs at low altitude. The bombs struck flight decks with devastating kinetic energy and punched through to detonate in hangars or machinery spaces. Fires and secondary explosions followed. Japanese carriers either sank outright or were so heavily damaged they required months of repair. Japanese efforts to counter this threat focused on improving fighter defenses and anti-combat air patrols were strengthened and vectored more effectively using radar. Anti-aircraft gun densities increased, filling the sky with fire that American dive bombers had to penetrate. Gun directors improved, tracking targets more accurately. Proximity-fused shells were introduced, detonating near aircraft rather than requiring direct hits. These measures increased American losses but could not prevent determined attacks from reaching their target. The fundamental vulnerability remained. Japanese carrier flight decks could not resist penetration by 0-pound bombs delivered from steep diving attacks. Once a bomb penetrated to the hangar deck, catastrophic damage was nearly inevitable. The only effective defense was to prevent American dive bombers from reaching attack positions, which required either destroying American carriers before they launched strikes or shooting down every attacking before it could dive. Neither was consistently achievable against American forces that grew stronger as the war progressed. By mid-1943, Japan had effectively lost the carrier. Surviving fleet carrier rehusbanded carrier rarely risked in operations where they might face new carriers entering service were smaller and less capable than the fleet carrier. Pilot quality continued declining as training programs struggled to replace losses. American carrier forces, conversely, were expanding rapidly. New Essex-class fleet carriers joined the Pacific Fleet in growing numbers. Each carried air groups with multiple SBD squadrons. Pilot training pipelines produced steady streams of competent aviators. The industrial advantage that had produced over 600,000 jeeps in the European theater was producing carriers and aircraft in similar profusion in the Pacific. The last major carrier battle of the war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. American forces deployed 15 carriers with nearly 900 aircraft. Japan managed to field 9 carriers with approximately 430 aircraft. The battle, known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw Japanese aviation massacred. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed over 350 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. Japanese attacks on American carriers achieved minimal damage. American counterstrikes by dive bombers and torpedo planes sank 3 carriers and damaged others so severely they never returned to service. The transformation in Japanese naval aviation thinking happened gradually, then suddenly. By late 1944, captured documents and interrogated prisoners revealed a complete reversal in how Japanese forces viewed American carrier aviation. The SBD Dauntless, dismissed as primitive and obsolete in 1941, was now described in Japanese tactical manuals as the most dangerous anti-ship weapon in the American arsenal. Training materials for Japanese fighter pilots devoted entire sections to engaging SBDs, emphasizing the critical importance of stopping them before they could begin their attack dives. Japanese naval architects studying carrier losses concluded that flight deck penetration by American dive bombs had been the decisive factor in every major carrier. The reports were clinical and devastating in their honesty. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived the war despite being aboard Akagi when she was destroyed at Midway, spent years analyzing what had happened. In post-war interviews, he stated flatly that the SBD Dauntless had changed naval warfare more completely than any other single weapon system. The aircraft itself was unremarkable, he noted, slow and vulnerable under most circumstances, but the combination of precision dive bombing capability, structural strength that allowed steep attack angles, and armor-penetrating bombs that could reach vulnerable internal spaces had created a weapon perfectly suited to destroying carriers. Japanese carriers, designed for offensive operations with minimal defensive protection, had been unable to withstand attacks they had never been designed to resist. The irony was not lost on Fuchida. Japanese aviation had pioneered carrier operations, and had developed dive bombing tactics that influenced American training. Yet when confronted with an opponent that combined adequate aircraft, competent pilots, and devastating weapons in overwhelming numbers, Japanese carriers had proven fatally vulnerable. The wooden flight decks that allowed efficient air operations had provided no protection against attack from above. The concentrated arrangement of aircraft, fuel and ammunition in hangar decks had created catastrophic secondary explosions when bombs penetrated. The offensive doctrine that emphasized striking first had left carriers exposed when American forces managed to attack first instead. Wade McCluskey, promoted to captain and awarded the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway, reflected on the battle in his memoirs. He noted that luck had played an enormous role. If his dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes earlier or later, they might have faced fully alerted defenses with fighters at altitude. If Japanese carriers had not been recovering with their decks crowded, the damage might have been containable. If even one of the 4 carriers had escaped destruction, the battle outcome might have been different. But luck favored those prepared to exploit it. His pilots had trained extensively on dive bombing techniques. Their aircraft, while lacking speed and maneuverability, were stable bombing platforms capable of precision attacks. The bombs they carried could penetrate carrier decks that Japanese designers had never intended to resist aerial attack from steep angles. Richard Best, who had personally bombed Akagi and later participated in the attack on her, commanded a total of 6 dives that day. His bombs contributed to sinking 2 carriers. He estimated that his squadron collectively achieved a hit rate exceeding 40%, extraordinary accuracy for combat conditions. Best attributed this success to the SBD's design characteristics that made precise dive bombing possible, even for pilots with limited combat experience. The aircraft forgave minor errors in dive angle or release timing. The dive brakes allowed fine control of descent rate right up to the moment of bomb release. The sturdy construction meant pilots could focus on accuracy rather than worrying about their aircraft disintegrating under stress. The production numbers told their own story. From 1940 through 1944, Douglas built 5,936 SBD Dauntless aircraft. This made it one of the most numerous carrier aircraft of the war. The contrast with Japanese dive bomber production was stark. Japan built approximately 1,500 Aichi D3A Val dive bombers during the war, less than 1/3 of American SBD production. Even accounting for differences in industrial capacity, the ratio revealed America's commitment to dive bombing as a primary anti-ship tactic, while Japan divided resources among multiple aircraft types and roles. By 1945, the SBD was being replaced in carrier squadrons by the faster Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. The Helldiver carried more ordnance and flew faster than the Dauntless, but many pilots who flew both aircraft preferred the SBD for its handling characteristics and reliability. The Helldiver had teething problems that the Dauntless never suffered. It was less stable in dives and more difficult to land on carriers. Veterans who had flown SBDs at Midway and through the Solomons campaign regarded the aircraft with affection bordering on reverence. It had been slow and heavy and vulnerable, but it had also been reliable and precise and devastatingly effective when used properly. The final assessment came not from Americans but from their enemies. Post-war interrogations of Japanese naval officers revealed consistent patterns. When asked to identify American equipment that had most influenced the war's outcome, Japanese commanders mentioned submarines, radar, and dive bombers in nearly every response. The SBD specifically was cited as having destroyed Japanese carrier aviation at Midway, when 4 fleet carriers were sunk in a single day. Officers noted that Japan never recovered from those losses, not just the ships themselves but the irreplaceable aircrews who died with them. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Japanese naval aviation had entered the war confident in its superiority. Midway shattered that confidence in 6 minutes of bombing that destroyed 4 carriers and killed thousands of the Navy's most experienced aviators. The transformation from dismissal to respect to fear had taken exactly 6 months. In December 1941, Japanese intelligence assessed the SBD as obsolete and unthreatening. In June 1942, SBDs sank 4 carriers, changed the Pacific War's trajectory. By December 1942, Japanese tactical manuals were warning pilots that American dive bombers represented existential threats to carriers and must be stopped at all costs. The aircraft had not changed. American pilots had gained experience but were not significantly more skilled in December than in June. What changed was Japanese understanding of what the SBD could accomplish when employed with precision against vulnerable targets. The lessons extended beyond naval aviation. The SBD's success demonstrated that simple, rugged designs optimized for specific missions could outperform more sophisticated alternatives under combat conditions. Speed and maneuverability mattered less than structural strength, stability, and precision when the mission required accurate delivery of heavy ordnance against critical targets. Mass production of adequate equipment supported by extensive logistics proved more valuable strategically than small numbers of superior machines that could not be easily replaced or maintained. These principles applied across military equipment and would influence design philosophy for decades after the war ended. The Dauntless had earned its place in history, not through technological innovation, but through being good enough in sufficient numbers at the critical moment. When Wade McCluskey pushed over into his dive above the Japanese fleet on June 4, 1942, he was flying an aircraft that was slower than enemy fighters, less maneuverable than enemy dive bombers, and carried less ordnance than enemy torpedo planes. But his SBD could put a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb precisely where it needed to go, through a wooden flight deck and into the vulnerable spaces below where Japanese carriers kept their aircraft, fuel, and ammunition concentrated together. 6 minutes of dive bombing erased 6 months of Japanese victories and set the trajectory for everything that followed. The aircraft Japanese intelligence had laughed at in 1941 had by 1945 become the weapon Japanese naval officers most feared and most respected. The dive bomber that cracked open carriers changed the course of the Pacific War forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.